Hi there. Welcome to another SYCK Career Podcast. On today's podcast, I'm going to get into it with Chris Talley and Zhang. Both of them are two software engineers that worked in the tech industry, worked at a lot of common companies that I've worked at, Salesforce, Tableau, Meta. And what these two guys have done is to expose and publicize information about the WARN rule. And the WARN is a law in the United States where companies must disclose when they are laying off people. And they have been monitoring those trends and sharing that information. And what they are doing is helping to level the playing field between employees and employers and sharing that information, making it transparent, and also reminding people, please remember this, that you are employed at will. You can get fired for any time, for any reason. We also talk about what the law actually does to protect you as an employee and gives you 60 days, usually sometimes longer, of severance. So when we talk about these companies that are giving generous severance packages, yeah, they might be doing that out of their own good heart, but they're also doing it because of legal compliance. So we'll dig into that. I think you're going to really enjoy this episode. And as a reminder, Academic Careers is here to help accelerate careers, here to help level the playing field between employee and employer, between candidate and interviewer, between the underrepresented minority and the overrepresented incumbent. So we're sharing information, we're sharing insights, we're sharing some SYCK advice so that you can learn and grow your career. And if you want to follow us, go to SYCKpodcast.com, SYCKpodcast, SYCKpodcast.com. Sign up for our newsletter. And if you like this episode, please review it. I read all those and I would really appreciate it. Thanks a lot and own your career. Welcome to another episode of the SYCK Career Podcast. And for the first time ever, I have two guests at once, two for the price of one the audience is getting. I have Zhang, who I used to work with at Tableau, but I really got to know a lot more through his presence on LinkedIn and some of the viral posts that he posted there about the WARN system, which we'll get into, the WARNTracker. And then Chris Talley, who is his partner in crime in developing the WARNTracker. Chris and I just met now, so it's kind of like a blind date for the two of us. But we have lots in common in terms of working at Salesforce, working at Facebook, working in the tech industry. But first, let me introduce the two of you. Steven, share a little bit about you with the SYCK Career audience.
Great. Yeah, this is the first time on a podcast, so super excited to be here. My background has been in data software tools. So I spent a couple years at Tableau as a software engineer. And then most recently at Airtable for 4 years. I think when I joined, we were about 100 people. And then when I left, it was around 1,000. So I got to see kind of hyper growth there. Also Tableau, similar like 3 or 4x during my time there. I'd always had an interest in clean tech, climate tech. So kind of on the side, I had been doing some investing and also advising and just community building in the climate tech ecosystem in the Bay Area and beyond. And when I left Airtable, I decided to kind of do full-time, explore opportunities in the space. And at the intersection of me being a software engineer and my interest in climate. And one thing I really know a lot about, which we could talk about later, is interviewing and getting jobs. So I was like thinking about that intersection. So one of the projects I made is in that space we can talk about later. And at the same time, I wanted to create content on LinkedIn sort of as an MVP, right? Media is like the most MVP you could do. And one of these posts went viral, got like 600,000 views. And it was the Google analysis of Google WARN records by title, like how many people got laid off in what office. And as a result of that, Chris has been a friend and former coworker. I was like, Chris, you want to spend a weekend, make this into an app, and do some coding? And so we did, and spent like 6 weeks working on this kind of on and off. And we've been really surprised by the traction. So that's why we kept going.
Awesome. And we'll get into that in a second, and we'll get into that post that had 600,000 views, which is not easy to do on LinkedIn. That tops any of my posts, by the way. So nicely done, Chris. Let's hear a little bit about you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Similar background to Steven, just a different set of companies, but software engineer. Been kind of through my rung of Silicon Valley companies. Worked at Salesforce, where you also worked. I was on the forecasting team. I'm not sure which part of the business you were on, but I guess we didn't cross paths. And then from Salesforce, I went to Facebook. Was there for a little while, working on e-commerce. It was like an e-commerce project that Facebook was trying to build out. And I think now it's been kind of meshed into Instagram, like selling infrastructure on Instagram. And then from there, went to Airbnb, had a really good time working at Airbnb. And after that, I was at Airtable, where I met Steven. So kind of, a long mix of enterprise and consumer software companies. Have had a really good time, and now I'm having a good time working on some projects, kind of autonomously, which has been really, really fun to just be able to explore our intellectual interests and curiosities without any forced direction. So it's been a lot of fun.
Nice. It's nice to have no boss, right?
Yes, definitely.
I will say, I think the thing on that note, one thing I didn't really realize, like, you don't really, I've done side projects, but it's always been while working full time or doing job search. And this feeling of like, oh, anything I do, any outcome that happens is only due to me, which also means like whatever I do, I can like reap the rewards of that outcome, even if, that outcome might be small to start with. That's pretty rewarding. I just, never experienced it myself.
Yeah, it's nice to make bigger impact, higher risk, higher reward, and more control. Great. So let's get into this. Chris, I'll ask you this. What does WARN stand for, and what is the WARNTracker doing? What did you create WARNTracker to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding right now about what WARN notices are. So this is great because I'm excited to be able to clear this up for folks. So WARN is a federal law. It is called the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act of 1988. And essentially what it requires is employers who are performing layoffs of a certain size. They have some criteria for layoffs to meet certain thresholds in order to qualify for WARN. And it requires those employers to notify the state government when they perform these layoffs. Now, some state governments also have their own like mini WARN laws that place even stricter requirements on the employer. So like, for example, California has very low thresholds for how many employees you need to lay off in order to, trigger WARN and need to file this notice. So what it means is that we get a pretty good resource for, most layoffs that are happening across the country. One of the things built into it is that they have to file these notices a certain number of days before the termination of these employees. And so I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about what that means. So what WARN does not do is it's not a very good way, at least for tech layoffs, to go in and see upcoming layoffs that haven't been announced in the press or anything like that. It's not like a secret look into the future about secret layoffs, right? The way that tech companies are getting around this is, let's say that California requires them to file the notice 60 days before laying off employees. What they do is, you get 60 days of severance or more, right? So if they tell you that you're getting laid off today, that doesn't mean that they had to file the notice 60 days ago. They need to file the notice 60 days before you go off of payroll. And so they might file that notice after they tell you that you're getting laid off. So it's not, just to be totally clear, it's not great for kind of predicting future layoffs, but it is a really good source for looking through these notices and seeing who are these layoffs affecting, which offices are they affecting. And in some states, we get some really, really good, rich data to give us more insight into what's happening in the industry.
So if I understand that properly, today is April 13th. If I was Microsoft, and I don't know what the Washington laws are, but if they want to lay off 500 people, and they issue that WARN notice to the state of Washington or wherever they're laying off people, tell me what happens. So it's April 13th, they notify the state. What information does that give to employees, if anything, or like how can employees look at this, or should employees not even look at this and it's more just for statistical evaluation and trends and things of that nature? If at all, can an employee use these WARN notifications?
Yeah, good question. I think so. It depends on the notice that's filed, but what we found is that a lot of the notices that are filed in California are very detailed. So I think as an employee, if I'm looking to join a company, there's a high probability that that is going to be a company that has performed layoffs. And so personally, I would look at the WARN notices for that company. A lot of these companies are still hiring. And I would look at what teams were affected if that data is available. So you can go either to WARNTracker, and we have links directly to, the government website where you can actually look up the PDF of that WARN notice, and go see what teams are actually affected, what roles are actually affected. Are you joining a business unit that maybe, and you'll have to interpret it yourself how you feel about that, if that makes you feel less or more comfortable joining, knowing that there have been layoffs in that area recently. But I think it's a really powerful tool for understanding what's happening to similar folks in the role and team that you're looking to join at that company.
Yep. And I guess just to answer, to loop back to your original question on that, I think specifically in that example, right? If you hear the news, Microsoft announced layoffs, or they, emailed employees or talked to employees saying they're doing layoffs, they very likely also filed a WARN notice already. Now, whether that shows up in the state government database or not, that's very dependent on basically the software behind each state's system. And then, it's Chris was saying earlier, it's very unlikely that if you're an employee, you'll see it first on the state's WARN system.
Okay.
For tech companies, right? They're pretty good about it's in their best interest not to let this information leak out through the government instead of them controlling the message.
So the way you phrase that, are there some companies that are less on top of this, and in some situations, the WARN notification could be an early indicator for potential gray clouds over an organization? Because you're saying the tech companies are knowledgeable about this rule, especially
there's actually, because the laws are so broad, there's tons and tons of like small businesses. If you just go on WARNTracker.com, we have tens or hundreds of thousands of companies in the last 16,000 companies in the last 3 years. And so I haven't looked myself, but there's definitely a bunch of companies here that aren't on layoffs FYI, for example, or, some of these other tech trackers. So I imagine it's possible if you work in a, local business that has offices elsewhere, they may not tell you that other people are doing layoffs.
Right.
Yeah. And
okay.
Other offices.
If you're looking at small companies. Yeah. Yeah. Small companies especially are much more likely to show up on records like this compared to, hitting the press.
Got it. And this is all publicly searchable information. People can go to WARNTracker, or it's also in the state government files. I guess you're pulling in information from all the different states and all their different reporting rules and regulations.
Yes. So we currently pulling 39 states. We refresh it more than once a day, at least once a day. For example, on this table, if you scroll to the right.
Yep. And for those listening at home, I'm showing WARNTracker.com. You can go there, and there's lots of great information here.
Yes, if you scroll on the right and click one of the blue buttons, right? So we have, for each layoff, it will open the URL of the state website where you can double check the data yourself. And
got it. So this was Compass, and this was for Illinois. So then it's showing their history of their past WARN reports.
And you have to, actually go open this file, like download it, open an Excel.
Yep. And you're doing that all for us. You're making it nice and easy for everybody to search.
Yes, that's our goal.
Awesome. So Stephen, talk about this post that you posted. And this is probably the one that initially got me, like you on my radar, because I was probably one of those 600,000 people that...
Yeah, actually, we connected before that because Tableau had some or Salesforce had some layoffs, and I helped organize the alumni Slack. I think that's probably first.
Yes. Yes, I think that is. And then I saw you explode. And so that, anyway, I forget the order, but let's talk about this LinkedIn post that you posted that had over 500,000 views.
Yeah. So, so I've just been posting consistently on LinkedIn. My idea for some background is like, again, if you're going to try to make products, try to, the lowest cost thing to do is write it as an article, right? And also I have a lot of thoughts, wanted to share them. I have a few friends who have led the way with much bigger followings, so I was just kind of inspired. With the WARNTracker, the Google layoff post, I had no idea it was going to go big. So give you some context, back in December, I posted this article, how I landed 18 FANG plus software engineering offers after 5 years not interviewing. It was kind of my process after Tableau, between Tableau and Airtable, my interview process. I kind of knew 18 offers. I'd never met anyone else with 18 offers. I have had this internal Google Doc that I floated with many friends, hundreds of friends for the last couple of years. So I knew that had the potential of going big, but this one I really had no idea, right? So what happened with that one was I heard from some friends that, hey, you can request these WARN records from state governments. Not only, what we just showed was each row in the table is company, date, number of laid off, but behind that is a PDF that, or, some document that every a document that every company has to submit to the state government, and some of them are very detailed. For example, Google had submitted multiple documents that are tens of pages, and they're just text tables with number of laid off, what the position is, and what building they're in. So it took a bit of work, but I requested all the Google California ones. I think it was around 5,000 total. So it's not the majority of the total layoffs, but it gives you a lot of granularity on what happened in the layoffs. Used my Tableau skills and made the charts and just kind of put it out there. I probably spent 2 or 3 hours on it, more than average, right? Because you'd have to make charts and stuff. But I really wasn't trying to make it go big. I was maybe I'll get, for context, I was getting 5 to 10,000 views per post for a normal post, right? And then I think I went to lunch that day with a friend after posting this, and I came back and I was blowing up. It's oh, wow, this is, somehow hitting a nerve. And after a few days, kind of uncovered why this particular post did so well. And I can go into that as well. But essentially, we have these charts, and I can share the link in the podcast notes of what it was showing. But it was just descriptive charts about here, title and role level data, ROLE, not ROW, of the Google layoffs most recently.
Cool. And Chris, you both worked at Airtable, so you're both good with databases, and Tableau you worked at. You're both software engineers. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes.
You're both Swedes. And Chris, talk a little bit about, was the Google, and I know Stephen, you mentioned this, but Chris, you're pretty immersed in the data too. Was Google's level of transparency unusual, or does this data exist for all the companies, and what you're doing is pulling it out there and making it easy for everyone to access and view?
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question because so we're not lawyers, obviously. I don't know what is legally required by the state of California for these companies to share these documents. We noticed that the large tech companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, had very detailed information in their WARN notices. And, we were able to parse that and kind of hopefully help people get insight into what's happening at these companies right now. But one thing that we also noticed is that some companies posted oddly vague and like really, really did not include much of any information in their WARN notices. But what we also noticed they all had in those cases was they would say, as required by state law, this additional information is available upon request if you reach out to a particular email address or at our office, physical office location. We actually haven't been able to get any responses from that email address so far, and we're both not in the Bay, so haven't been able to go request them in person. I would be very curious if anyone in your audience has any legal insight into kind of why that's the case, and if there's a better route for us to go to acquire that more detailed information, that would be great. But to answer your question, I think the data is probably there. I think there's probably a way to get it for all of these companies, but for whatever reason, it's not always present in the files that are hosted on the California Department of Labor website.
And I'll just add two other comments. One is Facebook probably Meta had the most granular data because they also included for each row of data the team name, which we didn't see with any other of the big WARN records. And then some companies like Salesforce and parts of Twitter, I think they would. So for Salesforce, the data set was like less than 10 rows, and they just grouped marketing together, marketing sales into like one entry essentially, and then like software engineers and product managers, all of that into like product development. If you go on WARNTracker.com, click the second tab and filter, click the Salesforce logo, you can kind of see for yourself there what that is. But I don't know the exact reason behind that.
Right. So there is a level of information that they need to disclose, but I guess some companies are making it harder for people to find than others.
Yeah. And okay, if I were to like speculate again, yeah. If I were to speculate, I would imagine, again, not a lawyer, but part of it is you do these layoffs, there's probably a million moving pieces and something slipped through the cracks. Probably, some legal person just copy pasted what was available, right? They didn't have the time to like, let's collate everything. Maybe they did, but maybe it was just like whatever was available in the HR system, in the HR software.
Right. Interesting. So what are some of the common pieces of data that you get in all the reports without having to go knock on their door in Menlo Park? Well, it sounds like Facebook or Meta shared that information, but there might be some smaller company or whatever. There might be Salesforce shared less information. So without you chasing down Mark Benioff in the Salesforce Tower in San Francisco, is there common information that every report has that gives you some ability to ascertain trends or across the industry in tech and other industries as well? I'll send this one to Chris because Stephen, you just answered the last question.
So things that we see pretty consistently, even among other states outside of California as well, is you can see office location, like the address of the actual office where the layoff happened, and the number of employees that were affected, and the date that the termination is active. Again, that termination date is the date that they go off of payroll. So they may get told about it 60 or 90 or 120 days before that date, and then get severance up until that date. But those are the things that we see consistently across all states and across all records for California. So, for job seekers going in, if you're looking at a company that, a large company that has many offices, oftentimes I think, again, if I was a job seeker, these offices are segmented by business, like particular businesses within the larger corporation or whatever. So it would make sense to, if you know the address of the office you're looking to go to, you may be able to infer kind of if people in your blast radius, I guess, have been affected by recent layoffs. And so, that's one way that you can use that kind of always available data to get some insight there.
Got it. And Stephen, what other ways do you see? A lot of people are going to WARNTracker.com. A lot of people are going to your posts. What else are people using this WARN data for? a lot of people are not aware of it, first of all. So I think you did a phenomenal job of making people aware of it. What are people like? What do you recommend people to use this data for in their job search, or in whether actively looking for a job, or if you're in a job, in terms of any warning signal that you should be concerned of? Everybody's employed at will. So any of us can get fired at any time for any reason. I guess they have to pay us maybe for 60 days after that, depending on the state. But what do you recommend people do with this data?
Yeah.
And
so
what
this
for?
General question of like, what do you do for layoffs and stuff? We actually have an article. If you go to our website, one of the buttons is laid off recently. And it's also helpful, like if you're preparing. And we kind of got this from all the bunch of friends who like came to us inbound after we published WARNTracker.com, sort of with like high level concepts and things to think about for each step of being laid off or in preparation for that. So that's kind of the high level thing. Specifically for WARNTracker, we also have a blog. So we've published some of our own insights from looking at this data. One an obvious one was, we looked at Meta and Google layoffs, and we kind of did an analysis of like, are they actually, cutting the managers like the popular media narrative is saying, or is it more proportionally cutting the ICs? So that's actually a very interesting insight, right? Because if you're at one of these companies and you're like worried about, if I'm a manager, maybe I want to like get ahead of this and become an IC. I think it's helpful to look at the data instead of like, we have title level data here. It's not complete, but it's better than like just basing it on, media speculation, right?
Do they say the level, or do they say the HR title? Like what?
They say the HR title, but we basically cleaned for Meta and Google, and a couple other companies. We cleaned all the title information and extracted the level and the
I see
whether they're manager. We had a couple friends who used to be at Google, like kind of double check it for us. So it's not it's not perfect, but we try to.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, did you find that there was any patterns with more managers or ICs? And I think a lot of these companies typically say like a 7-to-1 ratio of manager to IC. So you would expect on layoffs, for every 7 people, you'd have 1 manager laid off, approximately. I don't know if that ratio plays out well, 7-to-1, but what sort of patterns did you see between IC and manager?
Yeah, Chris, why don't you take this one?
What's your guess, Alan? If you had to guess at Facebook, how many ICs got laid off for every manager?
I would guess it's more than 7-to-1, because I'm guessing managers save their asses more than the ICs. So I would guess 12-to-1 ICs to manager. So I think I think Facebook in their first tranche laid off 11,000 people. I think it was. I lose track of the numbers. So I don't know, maybe 1,000 managers and 10,000 ICs.
Yeah, you're pretty spot on, man. So what we saw was 13.1 ICs for every manager.
Okay, manager.
Also, one other
which over indexes, yeah.
Yeah. So this was I think software engineering only that we looked at for like this granular level, but it is still a pretty large sample. So I think it was still meaningful. But yeah, we saw 13.1 ICs for every manager. That was a pretty good guess, actually. Most people have not gotten that close. Google, interestingly, was a little bit worse. You want to take a guess at Google?
If it's worse, well, Google layoffs were actually done even more secretively, from what I've heard from friends inside, than Facebook. So I would imagine that I know directors that had no idea that people in their team were getting laid off. So I think it was I would guess, and also you gave me the hint. So I would say, I think Google laid off 12K. I would guess, I don't know, like 1,000 to 11,000, but it's probably worse than that because you gave me the hint. So maybe it's like 800 managers and the rest are ICs.
Yeah, so I don't remember the raw numbers, but the ratio that we saw there was 18.6 to 1. So 18.6 ICs to one manager. One caveat there, we talked to some folks at Google, and they pointed out that titles do get a little bit like blurry. There are kind of a number of low, it's not super unusual for low-level managers to kind of retain IC titles or to be, operating as like a TLM, but they're technically ICs reporting to them, but they still have what looks like an IC title. So there might be some caveat there. Regardless of that, though, I think, these ratios kind of stood out a little bit given the narrative that we're seeing. So, take with that.
TLM is tech lead manager.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining that, Stephen. So, Stephen, are you also looking at trends over time? So this WARN data has been on the books since 1989, I think you said, and over the last year, a lot of layoffs occurring. I don't know, last 6 months, last 12 months. Are you looking at the velocity of WARN reports over time? And if so, are you seeing any trends occurring? Because that's actually probably really interesting. Everybody hears a lot of noise. All the news media likes to always talk about layoffs because it gets clicks, it gets animosity towards these companies. Are you seeing any trends occurring over the course of time since you've been tracking the data of uptick, higher, lower, anything in terms of volume?
Yeah. So how we're getting the data is we programmatically go through each of these states' government websites. Whatever files they have, we'll crawl them and parse the data. And a lot of them don't go farther back than 2020, 2019 or whatever. And some do. So we've just kind of made a cutoff of for now, WARNTracker is just focused on 2020 to 2023.
And so even though the law was in the books since the 1980s, it was only in this, it was only publicly reported since
Well, some of the data may not be publicly, it's not available on a website. You might have to email the state government, all that stuff. We actually did quite a bit of that to get the title level data, right? It's quite a process to get the Facebook and the Google data. Anyway, so that's a whole nother story. But I'm going on the website right now. So if we look for all states, and Chris, I think our data is from at least January 2021, right? January 2020. Right? So if we look at 2020, all states, how many total employees were laid off? Right now we have 1.8 million in 2020. 2021, we have about 150,000. So that makes a lot of sense, right? 2020, across the economy, definitely broad layoffs. I think that difference is steeper than if you looked at one of these tech layoff trackers. That's like a 10-to-1 ratio. You're not seeing that in these tech layoff trackers. I'm pretty sure. I have to double check. But because this WARN data represents, across the economy, right? You have fast food restaurants doing layoffs that have to report this. 2022, we have 170,000. And then 2023, so far, 80,000. So, not quite halfway through the year. It seems like the velocity is higher than 2022, but not at the rate of 2020. And my suspicion is probably from the media point of view, the narrative of layoffs increasing, that's mostly focused on tech companies.
Right. Okay. So interesting. So I think 2020, you said it was 1 point something million.
Yeah. So we've had 2.4 million since 2020, beginning of 2020. So almost more than half of that has been 2020.
Okay.
Employees
that was in COVID.
Employees laid off.
Right. Okay. So, and I think you said about 160 or so last year, and this year is on pace to beat it approximately, slightly.
I think it's ahead of pace because last year, 2022 is 170,000, and then this year is 80,000 so far, until today.
Okay. Right. And you multiply that by 3 or whatever, 240,000. But it's definitely come down since 2020. So, and that makes sense because some of these, and that's all the WARN trackers, or all the WARN reports.
That's all 39 states. Yeah. I can kind of go to California if that's interesting, or New York.
That it is interesting, but I think we'll dig into a rabbit hole there. But it sounds like it's the tech layoffs have been a higher percentage. I don't know if you have that as well, but I'm sure in 2020 with COVID, it was hospitality, restaurants, any physical location. Like everything was just shutting down, and airlines, things of that nature. I would imagine the percent of layoffs now, tech-related, companies that overhired, frankly, in 2021 are overly represented in that 80,000 year-to-date number. And is that 80,000 nationally? Or is that just California?
It's 80,000 because we're missing 11 states. But we have the biggest states are here, like New York, Texas, California.
Right. And you have Washington as well, Seattle, where the tech companies are. So of those 80,000, do you have a number or do you have a guess of what percent of those are tech-related layoffs? Because my hunch is if you just add up some of the numbers of the ones that have been publicly announced, Google at 12K, Facebook at 11K, Salesforce at 8K, Microsoft at 10K, a lot like that almost adds up to the numbers right away, all these tech layoffs that I'm just thinking about off the top of my head.
Yeah. So just again to reiterate on WARN, it's a subset of all the layoffs in the U.S. because you don't have to report it if you're in an office with like 5 people, for example,
right?
Depending on the law.
Got it.
If you look at the one of these tech layoff trackers, like Layoffs FYI 2022. Right now, they said 1,000 companies with 160,000 employees. So I think the right way to do the proportion would be for us to go through the data and like tag all the companies that are tech. We haven't done that yet. And then look at the proportion, because the reason you can't directly compare to Layoffs FYI or one of these tech layoff trackers is these employees include all everyone in the U.S. and also international, right? Which is a sizable amount. So it's like apples and oranges.
Okay, so layoffs.fyi is talking global and you're talking the US reported numbers?
Yeah. So the US reported numbers is smaller than the total US numbers. But and then the layoffs FYI and tech trackers are greater than that. And those are based, as I understand it, those are usually based on like media reports based on what the company PR departments say. I don't think you can technically you'd have to like go through every country with Google Office, let's say, and check if there's like a WARN system there and then like add up all the numbers to see if Google, actually laid off 11,000 or whatever, right? There's no way to actually double check that. You just kind of take it on face value.
Yeah. One other caveat.
Way into the weeds because, go ahead, Chris.
Oh yeah. One other thing to note there is the timing. So, there are very likely layoffs that have been announced publicly, but because of that timing that we talked about, the WARN notices may not have either been submitted to the government or the governments may not have published them to their websites. So I think it's good to keep track of both of these types of sources because one may be more accurate or more timely than the other, and it varies on a case-by-case basis. So sometimes you'll see the WARN record before you see big PR or something like that, and sometimes vice versa. But I think that timing is probably a big part, especially since, we're only in April, so it wouldn't take that long of a delay for, additional notices to come in and those numbers to kind of increase.
Got it. So I got one more question for you guys, and either one of you can answer this, and then we'll wrap it up. But what have you seen employees or employers change or do differently now that you guys made a fantastic value here of making people aware that this information is out there? So what have you seen as changes that either employees are making or employers, now that they know that people are watching this? What changes are you seeing on either side of the equation, employee or employer, now that this is more publicly? I never heard of this before, like a week before you guys posted on it. So what's changed from the employee side and the employer side now that this information, which is always supposed to be publicly available, now 600,000 more people know that it's available?
So I think I don't think I personally have any data on the employer side, but definitely on the employee side, I have a lot of pretty wide network in tech and other industries, and a decent number of my friends have been laid off. And just, responding to comments on these posts, awareness of this act was pretty low beforehand, right? Like Ellen, you mentioned you didn't know about it. And the number one response from my friends in California who got laid off, at least because they have a fairly generous like WARN period, like, wow, I'm really glad like the government did this in the 80s, or whenever the California one was passed. It just I think it gives them a little bit of buffer, being like, oh, you know what, like some of the severance is not just goodwill from the company, but also legally mandated. Like we have some labor laws for that. It's not as it's not to the degree. I'm not saying this is better or worse. It's just quantitatively, it's not to the degree of like these European laws, right? Where I read an article recently about like a lot of these tech companies doing layoffs in Europe are actually having trouble completing the layoffs because there's so many requirements on the period of the layoff. So I would say that's the biggest thing I see.
And a quick follow-up, just so that I fully understand. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that's a really important note. The fact that, like, as an employee getting laid off, when you see that generous, at least 60-day severance, like that wasn't, that wasn't necessarily out of the good of someone's heart. Like they were legally obligated to do that. So make sure you're looking out for yourself and, negotiating as appropriate and covering yourself, because it's important.
Cool. Well, we're approaching the end of our podcast, so I have two last questions for each of you, and we didn't even get into the job acquisition side. We talked more about the job exit side, and I'll have to have you back on, Stephen. I definitely want to have you back on about your 18 different offers that you received. I think out of like 20 applications. Is 18 out of 22? 18 out of 22. Ridiculous. Just to level set there, last time I was actively applying, I applied to 300 jobs and I only got 5 offers. So you did a hell of a lot better than I did. So I really want to learn from you, and I'll follow up on that. Last question I have for both of you. What's one piece of SYCK career advice that you would share with my listeners? And Chris, I'll go with you first here.
Yeah, I think my top piece of advice would be just really make sure you pursue your outside work interests and try to have side projects, whatever those are, whatever is interesting to you. Just go do it, and don't let your identity be tied up in your 9-to-5 job. I think like things like, you were telling us before, Kadima was born out of a side project, right? Like some of the best things that you'll learn, the like best exploration you'll ever be able to do comes from that. And it opens up a lot of opportunities to take control of your career and take it to directions that may not have been available had you stayed kind of within the lines of your 9-to-5.
Cool. Great advice, Chris. And Stephen, I'll flip it over to you. What's your parting piece of SYCK career advice?
Mine's a little more tactical. So when you do the full-time job search, or even part-time, but mostly full-time job search, really be intentional and like try to operationalize everything. I'm always just surprised with friends and friends of friends coming to ask me for advice on jobs. Just kind of a lot of times the basics haven't even been explored, right? Like you can Google a lot of these things, you can read articles about this and actually have a spreadsheet or Airtable base of all the companies you're looking at. Some people do that, definitely, but I'm just surprised by how many people don't. And I think if people put the amount of effort and like mindset they may work on, they put to like working on an important work project to their job search, they'll probably have a higher return, actually.
Got it. Yeah, I'm all for rigorous, methodical approach. It just works. Great. Then final question. Chris, I'll hand it off to you. Where can people find you and reach out to you?
Yeah, you can find me on WARNTracker. You can find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, that's mainly where I live online.
Great. And you, Stephen?
Yeah. So in addition to WARNTracker or LinkedIn, on LinkedIn, I've been writing a mix of layoff stuff, job search advice, and then climate tech job search. So more on the job acquisition side. Number one thing to recommend would be if you're software engineer looking for a job, check out climatetechlist.com. It's trying to make the go-to resource for software engineers looking to get into climate tech. And then if you're based in Boston, I also run bostonclimatetech.com. It's a newsletter of all the events in Boston related to climate tech. It's weekly newsletter.
Awesome. And yeah, with all these tech layoffs occurring in media, searching, like just people sitting in front of their devices, I think climate tech is a hot space. I don't mean that to be punny with global warming, but I do think that it's an area where we need to solve, and I think technology will get us there. So it's good to see resources and people deployed towards bigger problems to solve than how to optimize an ad to serve. So thank you so much, Stephen and Chris. This was a great conversation. I love getting into some of the details of this. Thank you for exposing all this information to empower employees to be more aware about their career and then take control and take charge. So thanks, guys. And Stephen, I will definitely have you back to dig into how the hell you got 18 out of 22.
Sounds great.
Job offers. And Chris, we can talk again too. But thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great chatting with you guys.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having us.
That wraps up another remarkable episode of the SYCK Career Podcast with Alan Stein. Check out past episodes and other resources on the website. That's syckpodcast.com, and it's SYCK. Alan, tell the audience about the newsletter they can sign up for.
The newsletter rocks. Check out the accelerator, XLR8R. You will get great tips about your career. You'll get honest insights. You'll get the occasional pet picture, and you will learn how to take proactive control and take charge of your career.
Very good. Very good. That's syckpodcast.com, SYCK. For your host, Alan Stein, I'm Russ Reba, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode. You are going to love the next one.